Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the American Psychological Foundation, and thank you for joining us for an APF at Home Fireside Chat. This is the third chat honoring the 2023 recipients of the APF Gold Medal Award for Impact in Psychology. I'm Dorothy Cantor, an APF trustee, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to be here today with one of our recipients, my good friend, Dr. Lenore Walker. As the premier grant-making foundation for psychology, APF awards over $1 million annually in grants, scholarships, and awards supporting psychologists and students using psychology to address major issues and improve lives. APF is unique in that it received the overwhelming majority of its support from individuals like those of you joining us today. We cannot express enough our gratitude to your investment in APF and the important research and innovative programming we continue to fund. As we proceed through the conversation, if you have any questions for Dr. Walker, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll do our best to get to them at the end of the program. But right now, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's guest, Dr. Lenore Walker. She is a trailblazer in the field, recognized for her groundbreaking research, advocacy, and coining of the term Battered Woman Syndrome, BWS. Her work extends far beyond the realm of psychology, leaving an impact on the legal system, public policy, and the lives of countless women for over 4 decades. Dr. Walker's tireless efforts have not only led to the recognition of BWS as a legitimate defense in federal and state courts, but have also paved the way for its application in personal injury cases and family courts. At the core of Dr. Walker's impactful contributions is the understanding that victims of familial and intimate partner violence share a common need for tailored mental health treatment. Over the years, her work has positively influenced the lives of hundreds of thousands of women and their families. Today, her efforts continue. They continue to guide and shape ongoing initiatives to address and combat domestic violence. Welcome, Lenore.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cantor. Although I think I'm going to have to call you Dorothy.
Please.
during our chat, as we are friends as well.
For a very long time. We don't talk about how long. Well, thank you for joining us today, Lenore. Let's dive right in. Your career has been defined by combining psychological research with advocacy. What do you see as the role of psychology in advocating for social justice, especially in the context of domestic violence? And by the way, how did you come to define Battered Woman Syndrome? There's a lot packed in there.
It sure is. That's a very interesting question. Way back when, in the 1970s, hard to believe, it's almost 50 years ago, we did not have child abuse laws in this country. They did not come into effect until around 1972 or so. And at that time, I was a new young assistant professor at Rutgers Medical School. And we were studying child abuse and how we were going to deal with a lot of these new laws that were coming forward. And we called it child abuse syndrome for the kids that we were seeing who had been abused by usually the father, but the fathers weren't coming in to the clinics at the time. It was the mothers who were bringing the children because they had all kinds of problems, because child abuse can indeed lead to psychological problems. So we called it child abuse syndrome. So when I started looking at the moms who were bringing the kids in, many of whom were being abused themselves by the same fathers, I just called it Battered Woman Syndrome, and the label stuck. Now, when it came to advocacy and social justice, I was thinking back, why did I, although I did not go to a traditional clinical psychology program at the time, I went to a program of applied psychology called school psychology. We still have them today, school psychology programs. And I know, Dorothy, you were also started your clinical career as a school psychologist. So we were learning a lot then about advocating for the children and sometimes for the teachers who we were working with when we were trying to make the environment better for kids so that they could learn better and have good psychological mental health at the time. So we really were doing advocacy work at the time, although we didn't think of it that way.
We didn't
Although,
call it advocacy. We
no,
didn't
we
call it.
didn't. I don't know if you remember Erwin Hyman. He was a long-time associate of ours, unfortunately has since passed away quite some time ago, but he was one of the earliest advocates advocating for no spanking in the schools, because he felt that when you hit a child, you were really teaching them that the people who were supposed to help you, be the closest to you, love you perhaps, also were the same people who were hitting you and hurting you. And so he was going across the country and came to me when I was doing the work with battered women way back then and said, you know, we're really advocates. And so I began to embrace the term being a psychological advocate, because we were doing good at that time, or at least we hoped we were doing good. And I guess we did.
And continue to.
I hope so.
You make me think that you were recently involved, or your work was involved in a presidential pardon case. So it's really come a long way in terms of advocating. And Biden pardoned a woman because he recognized that 30 years ago, her defense wouldn't allow her, or the courts didn't allow her, to use battered women syndrome as a defense. So how is psychology uniquely situated to provide important context for legal proceedings?
Well, you know, the law asks questions that psychologists may have sufficient research to answer or to help answer. And I learned that very early, especially in that case. This was a woman, at the time, her name was Beverly Iben Tamas, and she was the second case that came to me based on the first case. The first case was in Montana, and I testified. A lawyer found me, asked me to testify on behalf of a battered woman who killed her abusive husband in self-defense. And I said I didn't know a lot about the legal system. In fact, I knew very little at the time, but I did know whatever research was available at that time. This is 1977, I think, or 8, something like that. And so he flew me out to Montana. I had just moved to Denver, so going to Montana, you know, was like going out to the Wild West for me who grew up in New York. But off I go to evaluate this woman. In my opinion, I did a clinical and forensic psychological evaluation. I said she was a battered woman, and in my opinion, she acted in self-defense. She thought he was going to kill her. And the evidence was pretty strong because he came at her with a gun fully loaded, gave it to her and said, shoot me. And this woman, who was trained to obey him, or she was going to get hurt, just took the gun and without thinking, emptied the whole gun, all the bullets. And when the police came, she said, be careful. Don't go in there. He's going to be very angry. She had no idea that she had killed him, even though all the bullets were shot from that gun. And so, I went, I testified to what I knew, and lo and behold, the woman was found not guilty by that jury. And so the newspapers, I didn't know it was such a big deal at the time, but the newspapers wrote it up, and the lawyer for Beverly, Iben Tamas, his mother sent him a copy of the article. And so he gets the article and he calls me and says, would I come to Washington, D.C.? And it was a federal court case. Again, I didn't know. I said, sure. Now I'm feeling like, wow, this is interesting. A new way to give psychology away. And so I go, I do the same thing. I evaluate Beverly Iben Tamas. I looked at all the documents and I said, well, it looks to me like it also was in self-defense. And she, when the police were taking her to the homicide division, she said, why are you taking me here? He's going to be all right. Again, she didn't recognize, she saw him as omnipotent, that nothing could stop him from hurting her. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to be able to testify again, but they didn't allow me in court that time. I was able to give a proffer and talk about it, and they made a record of it, and that went up on appeal. And the appellate court ruled that, yes, this testimony could come into court. And because it was federal court, it carried the weight across the country, and it got published. The opinion got published, and that started me testifying all across the country. For the next 10 or 15 years, I went from state to state to state, doing the same thing, doing a forensic evaluation, stating my opinions, and then testifying in court. And it allowed the testimony then to be done by any other psychologist with the appropriate qualifications. So it was an interesting way of starting a new career for other forensic psychologists as well.
You raised a question for me. You said because it was a federal court decision, it was applicable to the states. Does that mean every state now accepts Battered Woman Syndrome as a defense?
Well, yes. Now, today, every state does accept it as a defense. But some states didn't accept it right away, and they actually had to go to the state legislature and pass a law allowing it. But today, every state does. So that's exciting to see that kind of a change. And many women now don't even get charged with homicide now, because the prosecutors have learned that for many of them, it is self-defense. We still have plenty of business, unfortunately. But because women, unfortunately, still have no choice if they want to survive. They have to use violence against those men. And if we would only make those arrests earlier, so that it didn't continue to escalate, I think we'd save a lot of lives and a lot of court time.
Right. But on the other side of the coin, are there defense attorneys now who are trying to claim Battered Woman Syndrome inappropriately? Or
Sure.
is that
Always a few that do. And there's a few men who claim Battered Man Syndrome. Sometimes I find the man has been battered, but it's a much smaller number than the number of women. And interestingly, when you look at the homicide statistics, because now we can always count how many people end up getting killed, what we are finding is the more services there are for women, the more men who don't die. The number of men who are killed is going down, but the number of women who are getting killed and women and children who are getting killed is either stable or going up. And those cases are cases where there are custody battles, the fights over who gets access to the children in those homes. And those are the most dangerous high-risk cases today.
Does that imply that the services for the battered women helps them to get out of the situation that they're in, and that's how the numbers go down?
Yes, the women have alternatives in the areas where they have a battered woman shelter, or they have a task force, or they have mental health centers where they'll provide services. So the earlier we can get services for women, the more men are going to stay alive. We don't necessarily stop their abuse. The only time the abuse goes down is if he's in prison. But we don't keep him in jail and prison very long. And that's a problem for the women.
In your experience, has the general understanding of intimate partner violence and self-defense evolved over the years within the psychological and legal communities?
Yeah, I think, Dorothy, that there's a change in how people see domestic violence, but it's changing again, if I will. The earlier change was nobody really recognized it. People often blamed the woman for her own abuse. And so it took a long time for us to get all the healthcare and mental health care people to understand what domestic violence was, that it isn't a two-way street. It's he decided, the abuser made the decision to react to whatever happened with violence. Unnecessary violence. There are, I mean, women can be awful. I'm not saying we don't do things that can make people angry. Of course, we, as you know,
We do.
We do. But the answer is there are many ways to deal with that, especially in a relationship, in an intimate relationship. Seeking help, going to see a therapist, getting a divorce, go see a lawyer, walking out and cooling down, finding other ways, learning how to meditate. I mean, there's so many ways of dealing with getting angry and your anger rising. And so we know that. And yet these guys don't stop. Now, there have been some successful treatment programs, very few, but some. And those data suggest about a third of the men who actually will go through the treatment program, because so many of them don't. They get court ordered, but the courts don't follow up on it because they don't treat it as serious. And I suppose it's because our court system is so overloaded with so many serious problems. Our country, as in the rest of the world, I think is in trouble. We have so much abuse and so much violence going on. So there just isn't the person power to be able to follow up, which you have to do in these kinds of cases. And so that's what's changing today. Whereas we had a number of things that were placed, we meaning all the advocates in the domestic violence field, we had a number of things in place that put the legal system kind of as the hub, and everything sort of stemmed from there. And they followed up with the healthcare system, with housing for people, all the different social systems that we need. But as our social fabric in our country is unraveling, which unfortunately I think it is, unraveling, so too are all those systems that were put in place. And since COVID, when everybody was locked down in the same house, the number of homicides, of killing between the women, the men, and the children has been raising, and it has not gone down. The number of women who are being killed is continuing to rise. So that's telling us the systems are not working.
Clearly. You know, I was struck,
Yeah.
and I think I texted you the other day. One of the clues on Jeopardy, the answer was Battered Woman Syndrome. And they called it Battered Wives Syndrome. I let them get away with it, but I thought that's how influential Lenore Walker's work is. You made it onto Jeopardy.
And it wasn't even one of my cases.
No, I think it was actually in England.
Yes, which is great, just great.
So now we can say that the influence of your work is international. That we know at least that in England someone got off on a battered woman.
You know, my latest murder mystery book is about Hong Kong, where I actually testify in a case. So it is international. I have helped open up the testimony in other countries as well.
So to me, when we're talking about impact, that really says what impact is, Lenore. You've identified a problem, you've named it, and now you have the courts in this country and around the world recognizing what can happen, doesn't have to happen, but what can happen to women who are victims of violence. That must feel really good for you to know that you've done that.
It does. It does.
And lest you stop there, my dear, could you provide some insight into your recent projects, such as the adaptation of the STEP program in federal women's prisons? Tell us what that is and what outcomes you're hoping to achieve.
Well, you know, my research, along with testifying in court, I continued my research. I went back after being on my own in my own independent practice of psychology for 20 years. I went back in the late 1990s. I was invited by Dr. Ron Levant, who was then the dean at Nova Southeastern University's psychology program. And he asked me to set up a forensic psychology program for our doctoral level students there. And so being on a faculty, I went back to my research and started, I had wonderful students who helped revise the earlier research that I had gotten an NIMH grant for at that time, or earlier. And so we started doing the research again and collecting the data. And as we collected the data, people were saying, well, why don't you have treatment for people? And so we started designing treatment programs based on the data we were collecting. And I called that, I like giving names, so I called it Survivor Therapy Empowerment Program, or the STEP program. And we went into Broward County here in Florida, where I am. We went into the jail and we started offering it to inmates who were there, women inmates who were there, because they were sitting in jail and they really had time to think about what got them there. Many of them, it was drugs or other alcohol or other forms of drugs, or some other problem that arose from the duress from an abusive relationship. Not all, but many of them. And so they use the time to do the program with us. And that was exciting to see that it really did work. Being on a faculty, we could do it evidence-based. We could do the research. So we did that, and we were able to publish it, and we were able to get the attention of the federal psychologists who worked in the Federal Department of Corrections. Now, I have to admit, many of my former students are now working in the federal system.
That
So
helped.
they were aware of the program, and they knew it was a good program. And so they invited me to apply for a grant that was written for us to be able to use it. And I was able to afford hiring a number of younger researchers with me to be able to revise the program so that it would conform to what is necessary in the federal prison system. There are 15 federal prisons where women are located. And while they're doing some time, it's a perfect time for them to have programs so that when they get out, they will be able to become full engaged citizens, which is not easy once you've spent some time in prison. So it was an interesting new project, and we loved doing it. And we developed it. It took us about a year and a half to be able to do it, and then we trained psychologists who were in the federal prison to use the program, and hopefully they're using it.
How long have some of those inmates been out in order for you to track the success?
Well, the ones from the program, I don't know, but we don't get those data. But the ones from the earlier work that we were working with in the jails, and from all of my testimony, I mean, it's been about almost 50 years that I've been providing the testimony. And I have to say, very few have ever been rearrested. And these are women. Most of these women have committed fairly serious crimes. But once they were released, and governors in a number of the states, we tried to help them release these women because they're not committing another crime. Then most of them didn't commit any crimes before this. They only acted to save their own lives or their children's lives. And so we persuaded governors to be able to release some of them. Maybe one or two of them got into some trouble with alcohol or drugs, substance abuse issues, because that's one of the self-help measures that women who have been traumatized will use. But most of them have never committed another crime, which at least I haven't heard of it. So that's exciting.
It would be a nice follow-up study at some point because you have nothing else to do. If you were talking about your graduate students, and it reminds me that everyone who wrote a nominating letter for you highlighted your generosity in mentoring psychology grad students and early career researchers and faculty. How does that mentorship contribute to your work in the field?
I learned so much from the young people that I'm working with. They come into psychology with fresh eyes, and it's good to have. We once had a good friend who used to talk about having two eyes, one to see backwards and one to see forwards. Well, it's good to have young people as well as our, I don't want to call us older colleagues, but our age, our generation colleagues being together because we learn from one another. And I find them to be so inspiring, and it keeps me young. It keeps me feeling like I can keep going on and on and on, even though I probably should have retired 20 years ago.
Well, I think they challenge you in a lot of ways and make you think about what you're doing. But the other thing that strikes me as you were talking earlier is that you, in mentoring and in starting the program at Nova, have developed a cadre of people who can do the work that you developed. So it doesn't end with you.
That was my legacy. Those young people out there, and they are doing the work. Many of them may even be listening to this to this call. They are out there because this is tough work. It's not easy. We're working with violence. We're working with images that are not pretty. We're breaking down denial. People don't want to hear about all kinds of violent acts. We don't want to believe that people can engage in that behavior. And people wouldn't engage in that behavior if they had other alternatives for the most part. But we live in a society that doesn't give us a lot of alternatives. And that's tough. I want it to be a better society. When I was younger, I used to think that maybe we could eradicate domestic violence in my lifetime. Well, I'm not so sure that's going to happen.
Well, if you live a very long time, Lenore. But you lead right into the next question I was going to ask you, which is, given the emotionally challenging nature of your work, especially dealing with the domestic violence and trauma, what are some of the strategies you utilize to ensure your own emotional well-being?
Well, one of the most important ones is having a very strong friendship network, which of course, Dorothy, you're part of.
Yes.
We have a wonderful group of women, and we spend at least twice a year together going someplace fun. And that's the second part of it, is to make sure we don't forget to have fun and laugh a lot. Because the world can be grim if you only see the grim side. There's also beauty side as well. And so I tried to surround myself with that. And having good family. I have a wonderful wonderful husband and a wonderful children and grandchildren, and I even have a great-grandchild now. So these are the things that make our life filled with pleasure and with joy. And so I really make sure that that's in my life. My faith is in my life. And so these are the things that I try to keep balanced. Um, Sometimes I work a little too hard, but for the most part, I play hard too.
Yes, you do. What do you see as the future challenges and opportunities for psychology in addressing gender violence?
I think psychology has an enormous role to play in reducing gender violence, in understanding it. We need to do more research. We need to understand, how do young children develop the kind of mental state that allows them to then commit violence against other people, because they're not born that way. Babies aren't born violent. They have different temperaments, and we need to learn more about parenting strategies. And in domestic violence cases, we really have to reform the custody courts. And we spent a lot of time helping women learn that they can get out of domestic violence relationships with protection, but their children are being forced to go back and forth in these relationships. And they're learning that nobody's stopping some of these fathers from abusing their mothers. and learned behavior can be changed. So that's the challenge for psychology. We have to make it clear that yes, we have tools that we can use, but we can't do it alone. That's why I started working with the legal system. We need to have the strength of the legal system that has the consequences to stop the kind of violence early before it explodes.
You know that our gold medal for impact in psychology is a new concept for APF. I wonder what impact in psychology means to you. Small question.
Well, I'm honored with this award. You know, growing up, even as a psychologist, even all those years as a psychologist, I looked at some of these heroes who were awarded the Gold Medal Award, even before it was called Impact. And they did have an impact on the field. They were giants in my mind. So to think of myself as part of that is daunting. It's very daunting. But I feel privileged. You know, I grew up with a lot of privilege, not money. We were not wealthy people. We were just average people. In New York City, we had a small little apartment that I shared a bedroom with my brother. You know, during my growing up periods, but we had books, we had newspapers, we sat around before television. Hard to believe it was before television when I was a little kid, but we sat around reading books and talking with one another about what we read. Um, so it was a lot, it was privileged. I had a family that believed in education and believed that girls could be anything they wanted, just like boys. So that kind of equality isn't in every home, but I had that. And so I wish my mom and dad were here to see this award. They would just be so proud, as I am. So it's an honor to be part of this group.
So you were talking about reading a lot, but I need to talk about your writing now. This is what you do in your spare time, which I don't know where you find, but you now have written or have started a mystery series in which Dr. Ariel Lewis, who is a forensic psychologist, imagine that, and your alter ego is engaged in crime solving. You want to tell us a little bit how you came to start writing mystery novels, Lenore?
Well, you know, Dorothy, at our age, many people are starting to think about writing a memoir. But a lot of the cases I've worked on, I really can't write a memoir about because they're confidential information. Like many of us as psychologists have accumulated over the years. So I wanted to write about it, but I didn't quite know how to do it. And then I realized, you know, sometimes when I go to parties, you try to find something to talk about it with friends, and they always like to hear some of my stories about some of my cases that are over, and I disguise them so you don't know them exactly, and people listen. So I thought, well, maybe I'll write some mystery novels, and I love reading mystery novels as well. And so I tried writing the first one, Madness to Murder. And I thought, well, you know, I've published 25 professional books. I won't have any trouble getting a publisher. Well, I could not find anybody who wanted to publish a murder mystery. Nobody wanted my murder mysteries.
You would first have to show them that you have a following of 1 million people. Then they'll buy your murder mystery.
Well, I went to HarperCollins. I couldn't even all of my that's what happens when you outlive your agent, you outlive your editors. They weren't there anymore. So I said, okay, but what we do have is we have, Amazon and Kindle books. And I thought, well, why don't I just put it on there? And so that's what I've done. You can buy them for $15 instead of $80 or $90, whatever they're selling hardcover books for. You can buy a soft cover book. I have them on my shelf back there. So I wrote the first one, A Madness to Murder, and I loved it. I loved writing. And I took a writing classes, of course, to learn how to write fiction. And now I just put on the second one called Murder in Hong Kong, which is based on, the first one was really somewhat based on a real case. The second one is an amalgam of different cases. It's not just one case. Although the Hong Kong pieces were similar to when I was actually in Hong Kong, but I changed all of the facts, so they're different. And now I'm working on the third one, which is Murder in the Condo. And so it's about murders that happen in the condo in which I live. And a few of them are real and a few of them are totally made up, but Ariel Lewis is going to solve them all.
Of
But
course
she
she
gets in
is.
trouble in this one.
Don't tell us too much. By the way, I especially loved Murder in Hong Kong. Is there anything we haven't covered that you would like to share, Lenore?
Oh, I think we've shared most of what I've been doing.
Well,
But
this
maybe
would
people
be
have some questions.
the time, folks out there, to write your questions. The only one I found so far on the Q&A was a welcome. But here's a question. As neuropsychologists, we have objective measures of ability suppression and response bias. Do you use any of these in your forensic evaluations? Additionally, and of equal importance, what methods, procedures, and policies do you have for mitigating examiner bias?
Those are good questions. In our forensic evaluations, we use a combination of clinical evaluations and development of histories from the client. We then use standardized psychological tests that have validity measures in them. So if somebody is not using the right amount of effort, or if they're using effort to try to bias the data, that usually shows up in the standardized tests. We use those tests that have those validity measures in them. And we also use documents. So we're constantly comparing what information we're getting with what other people have seen in the documents. If there's been prior arrest records, we want those. If there's prior medical records, we want them. We try to match them with some of the events and the histories that we get. So an evaluation that we do takes about 30 hours. So it's a long evaluation. It's not quick. And I often have people fly into Florida now that I live in Florida, and they spend 2 days with myself and my staff going through everything that we get. So by the time we're finished, we know them pretty well. There may be some bias. I don't think you can eliminate 100% of bias, but that's what cross-examination does as well, and in depositions and in trial testimony. So I think with all the checks and balances, I feel pretty confident that we do it within a reasonable degree of psychological certainty.
The next question is, this one's not too broad, Lenore. What do you see as possible solutions to bringing down death and injury rates for women and children?
More services, very easy. More services for women and children. More psychologists learning how to work with women and children who have been abused.
You got to a simple and very concise, good answer. I'm not surprised. Next question. I'm a fan of this groundbreaking work. I'm hopeful we can move the language away from heterocentric terms like the man and the woman. As I'm sure you know, intimate partner violence impacts relationships of all kinds, including same-sex couples. Your work applies there too and is important in the understanding in these cases.
Yeah, I tried to cover that. I agree that domestic violence takes place in all different kinds of combination of couples. But we can't do away with the fact that the perpetrators in most of these, even in lesbian relationships, the data are clear. You have less violence. You have more psychological abuse. And I'm not minimizing the psychological damage from psychological abuse. It can be tremendous, and coercive control can occur in all relationships. We know that. But when we're talking about domestic violence, one of the reasons why I stayed working in cases where when the violence went so far that somebody felt that they had to kill in self-defense. They needed to be able to save their own life, is that it lets you look at the patterns in violence and in those relationships much more clearly because it's so exaggerated. Thankfully, there's not that many cases that end that way. Most of the cases end with psychological problems.
The next is a comment, and I'll let you guess who it's from. It says, aloha. The next.
I wonder if it's from our pet.
Sure it is. What a role model you are, Lenore. Can you please share more information about your cross-cultural contributions in this area of work and research?
Well, thank you. You know, from the very beginning, I recognize the fact that people who end up in prison, in jails and in prison, are often people from minoritized groups. The same behavior can be committed by a white male who ends up not going to jail or prison, and a person of color who does go there. Our prisons are filled with people who are definitely of a minoritized group and who didn't get a fair trial. Many of them are also poor people who did not get access to lawyers. Now, in the cases I worked on, so many of them were public defenders, and they were willing to go out on a limb and really study and learn something new for their clients. But not in every state does that happen, and not in every jurisdiction does that happen. So they're less likely to get the kind of defense that they need. There is a decision called the APF decision that was passed by the US Supreme Court a number of years ago that said every defendant is entitled to a psychological evaluation if they claim that they've been what they did has something to do with psychology. And so the state has to pay for the evaluation, but they don't have to pay for a trained person. They don't say anything about the credentials. So a lot of people are doing it who really don't have the ability to do it. And lawyers don't understand that, and judges don't understand it, and so they allow that to happen in their courts. So there's a lot of cleaning up that we need to do. We have the ability to do it, but unfortunately, it's not getting done as well as it should be.
The next question is, given the risks of violence for couples, what kinds of therapy models for improving relationships have you found helpful, if not contraindicated due to risk factors?
Well, I think the highest risk factor for being in a domestic violence relationship for a woman is simply being a woman. There's no other risk factor that's as high as just being a woman. However, the biggest risk factor for a man using violence is having seen his parents in a domestic violence relationship. So what does that tell us? Well, if we have children that are involved in a domestic violence with their father, or seeing their father batter their mother, or their mother battering their father, if that's the case, that means those children are at highest risk. And what do? In the family court? We force them, even when they don't want to be with both parents, they have to share parental time. Wrong thing to do. And as long as we continue to do that, we're going to have the next generation and the next generation of batterers. And unfortunately, we have not been able to get the family court or psychologists who work in the family court system to understand that being with two parents who are kind, gentle, and have their children's best interests at heart is good. But being with two parents where one of them is not going to stop abusing her is not the right kind of decision to make. So these are the big problems for the next generation to solve.
One more comment and question. The comment is, a memoir might still be in order. Don't give up on that. The question is, when women come to us and share that they're experiencing verbal and emotional abuse, maybe the husband or partner is an alcoholic, etc., I often request that they call a domestic violence hotline and/or see the internet for organizations that can advise them. Additionally, we start a period of psychotherapy to build self-esteem. Would you comment on this and add what else you believe is appropriate?
Can you repeat the last part of the question? I didn't quite get it.
I'm sorry. We start a period of psychotherapy to build self-esteem. Would you comment on this protocol, if you will, and add what else you believe is appropriate when women come in?
Well, I think what the most important thing when a woman comes in is absolutely listen to her and go over the events. I use a trauma specific protocol. You know, I'm privileged to be chairing the APA task force. I think it's the working group on PTSD and trauma guidelines for professional practice. And one of the most important things is to really understand and learn what a trauma specific protocol is, and to use that protocol when you're working with anyone who has experienced any kind of trauma, and domestic violence is definitely experiencing that kind of trauma. And so that's really, it's not just self-esteem, although of course we want to raise people's self-esteem, but we also want to raise their empowerment, their self-efficacy, their belief in their ability to take back their ability to protect themselves with help sometimes. And so that, I think, is how, what I would call it, rather than just self-esteem itself, but self-efficacy, which is most important.
That has to be our last question from the audience. My apologies to those we didn't get to. Thank you for taking the time to speak to all of us, Lenore. It's an honor. I've known you for years, but it's an honor to learn more and celebrate your commitment and impact on the field of psychology. I'm proud to call you my friend, and congratulations again on your well-deserved gold medal. Thanks also to all of you for joining us today. Don't miss out on the rest of our Fireside Chats resuming in April with Dr. Mark Hatzenbuehler. Visit the event page on the APF website to register for this and other upcoming conversations. And if you want to listen to Lenore again, this video will be up there on our website in a few days as are those of prior Fireside chats. So good night to all of you. Stay well and join us in April. Bye.